Hello, here we are. This is Bobby Grow coming at you live from Vancouver, Washington. It's the 19th of June, 8:47 p.m. sharp. And we're going to talk a little about theology tonight. I have a moment here where I can do this. So haven't done one for a long time. And so I thought I'd jump on here real quick and do this. It's just off the top as usual. So nothing well thought out or anything like that, although I'm going to talk about a couple things that I have been thinking about. And I have thought about. So I've spent time on what we'll be talking about a little bit here. I just haven't, I don't have anything planned out. I don't have any notes or anything like that for this. So be all off the top again and with nobody to interact with. So it's just me that you're stuck with for this broadcast. And so welcome. In this one, I'm going to talk about, like I said in the title to this, Reformed confessions, and how those relate to, I guess, I don't know what you'd call it, intercollegial or intercollegiate. It's not really collegiate, though. Interdenominational discussion that's been happening, intertraditional, and particularly with focus on the Baptists, Reformed Baptists and the Southern Baptists, and how those two intersect one way or the other, whether they do or they don't, in the positive or the negative, I guess we could say. So I just want to talk about that a little bit. That will get us into, so like I said, dealing a little bit with this idea of confessionalism, not really getting into the Reformed confessions in any kind of material way, but just talking about how confessionalism as a mindset, even as an approach, an ecclesial approach and posture, looks versus or juxtaposed, I guess, to or with the Reformed Baptists. And I'm going to use James White as an example of the Reformed Baptists, because I think, at least in the online world, especially in the YouTube world, he probably has the largest presence among that crowd of Christians in the American church anyway these days. So I'll just talk a little bit about him. I don't really watch James White that much. I don't pay much attention to him. I mean, I've known of him for years. I've read a couple of his books years ago on the King James Only controversy and his book on Roman Catholicism. And so I think those are the only books I've read from him. I mean, I have listened to him over the years, of course, and I know about just his approach and what he thinks theologically, and where he thinks from, how he thinks. So, I mean, yeah, I do know that about James White. So, yeah, I'll just use him kind of as a foil, I guess, to discuss confessionalism, theory of authority, theory of ecclesial authority, church authority. Like, where does that come from for the Protestant Christian? And I'm just going to touch upon them briefly, like I said, and we'll see how it goes. So if you have a YouTube account and you're watching this, and you can have the chat open, so you can post a comment and get into the chat here. I'm using, obviously, StreamYard and interfacing with YouTube through StreamYard. So yes, if you do have, like I said, an account, then you can post a comment. If you do post a comment, I might try to interact with it. So if anybody pops on here on a Sunday night, kind of late for some people probably, that'd be great, but I don't expect that right now. So this is in lieu of writing a blog post. I'm actually going to write a blog post touching on some of the things I'm going to talk about here. So I'll be writing a blog post following this video. So anyway, so basically, I grew up conservative Baptist. My dad's a conservative Baptist pastor, was a conservative Baptist pastor. He retired. He's now gone on to be with the Lord just a year and a half ago now, which is still weird to say on his Father's Day. Yeah, it's sad, of course, but we do agree as those with hope in the resurrection. So he's there. He's filled with great joy, and so. But I grew up in the ministry, the pastoral ministry, with my dad. He included me from a very young age in pastoral ministry with him, and so back in those days, we did a lot of door-to-door evangelism. We did a lot of evangelism in a variety of different ways. And that was a major focal point for my dad. He definitely had the gift of evangelism. I think I have the gift of evangelism. And so that was my upbringing. It was started out kind of more fundy-ish, I guess we could say, like most evangelicalism used to be. And then, of course, we kind of progressed a little bit, not doctrinally, but socially. We progressed and became evangelical. And so that's that's my background. Is I'm Baptist. I'm Baptistic still. We don't attend a Baptist church now, but that's still my background. I would say primarily doctrinally. So when issues surrounding anything Baptist pop up, like they have recently, particularly with the Southern Baptist Convention, I pay attention. I mean, if you're on Twitter, which I'm not on Twitter as much anymore, I've been trying to cut back on that, and I have actually the last 2 weeks. But if you're on Twitter, there is a large Southern Baptist presence. Primarily, at least the ones that I know of they're like the academic side of it. They're mostly young guys, youngish guys, newly PhD'd. Some of them have had their PhDs for a little bit, but most of them are professors in Southern Baptist institutions, seminaries, Bible colleges. So that's kind of the contact that I've had in the past, in particular with the Southern Baptists. And so that's been kind of my angle into that world. And it's a different world than even what I grew up in the Conservative Baptist, the CBA, the Conservative Baptist Association, which is my dad is ordained in that tradition, in that denomination. So that's really a kind of different, a different and completely different culture, church culture from the Southern Baptists. And of course, there's doctrinal overlap and doctrinal, like as far as the theory of the church, the autonomy of the local church, and things like that. There is some overlap there between CBA and SBC, and of course on baptism, so we share a lot of course, core beliefs as Baptists, and so there is that level of interest there for me as well with them. But their culture is way different. Like I'm trying to say, is that their culture is distinct. And so it's not something that I am personally or immediately familiar with. So I come to the Southern Baptist Convention secondhand exposure, I guess. And so that's my way into it. And so, I mean, as many of you know, there's within the Southern Baptist Convention, which they just had their annual convention, and it was in Anaheim, California, I think now just a week or 2 weeks ago. And so they just held that. They just elected a new president, and that was very controversial for them. I don't even know the name of the guy who they elected this time. So that's how close I've been paying attention to that. What I have been paying attention to is just the kind of the noise around it. And I know that there's a conservative, what they would say is our conservative side, which is really consists of the Calvinist side in the SBC. Most of the so-called the outspoken conservative SBCers are like hardcore 5-point Calvinists, and that's what they're into theologically. And so they're pushing for I don't know why his name escapes me right now. Dang. Black guy. He's a black guy. You'll know who he is if you care about the SBC or know anything about the SBC, you'll know who I can't remember his name right now, which is ridiculous. But anyway, they were pushing for him. Basically, the conservative side in the SBC is pushing for him to be voted in as the president for the convention, and he didn't win. He lost, and so I guess it was a 60-40 split. And I don't even know who the other guy is. All I know about the other guy is that he represents like the progressive side in the SBC, and which entails promoting critical race theory as and that's really kind of the basis of that, of the progressive so-called side in the SBC. And they are progressive, actually, culturally. They align with some of the progressive emphases that are present in our culture writ large right now. So it's CRT, critical race theory. Female seems to be like an openness to women being ordained as pastors, and at least an openness to that. I don't think that they've actually made that move quite yet, not officially. Anyway, I know they haven't done that officially, but I think the conservative side's afraid that that's the slippery slope that they're on, and it does appear that that's the direction they're heading. So the ordination of females into the pastorate, and then I'm not quite sure on the homosexual part of it. I'm not quite sure if the LGBTQ stuff is so much rooted in the more mainstream, let's call it that, the more mainstream side of the SBC. I haven't really seen any promotion of that among the guys who I follow on Twitter. But who knows? I mean, there does seem to be some level of slippery slope there. So anyway, at least that's what the conservative side, of course, is spying out per their lights as far as what they consider to be progressive, the progressive takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, so you had the black guy, and I'm frustrated, I can't remember his name. So I don't remember his name. It might come to me later. But then the other alternative was, for the conservative side, was Tom Buck. And I think so either one of those guys, Tom Buck and the other dude I can't think of as far as his name, they were kind of the last hope, I think, for these conservatives who have tried to stay in the SBC as long as they can. And I think their philosophy has been to try to save the SBC from their perspective and kind of bear witness within the SBC and to keep it from sliding off into progressive oblivion from their perspective. I say that. And they might be right, and they might not be right. I think they probably are onto something there, because it's a trend. So in evangelicalism as a whole. So I don't think that they're necessarily wrong in identifying this kind of slippery slope that the apparent majority in the SBC seems to be on at this point in time. And it's not new, actually, to the SBC either. So, the SBC, I remember my dad we had a SBC church. He pastored a church in North Long Beach, California. And there was an SBC church around the corner from us. And so I would ask him about it sometimes. And he would just tell me that they were more liberal. So that's back in the early 90s. When we talk about that at that point. And they kind of had that liberal drift, and that went back further than the early 90s. But but then there's been this resurgence, so to speak, of, that's what they called it even in certain sectors, of returning back to a more conservative, what the conservatives would call orthodoxy. When they're talking about returning to Reformed distinctives, Reformed Baptist distinctives, Calvinism, 5 points of Calvinism, and other distinctives. So, and I'm really generalizing here, because even these academic SBC guys who I know, who these conservatives would consider to be on the left in the SBC, a lot of them, they're 5 point Calvinists too. So I can't, I don't want to make too making too sweeping of generalization, but there is this kind of general split, and it has to do maybe less to do with the theological distinctives and more to do with the adoption of sociocultural norms within the SBC. So I don't necessarily think this is an Arminian versus Calvinist debate or something like that. I've seen some trying to frame it that way, and I don't believe that's the case at all. I think because, like I said, these guys who on the conservative side would consider the guys who I know, these academics, professors in the SBC seminaries and Bible colleges, they're right in line with the conservatives doctrinally, like theologically. So it's the distinction then is sociocultural, and it comes back to the adoption of critical theory, critical race theory, and any kind of subsequent developments that might come out of adopting that mood. So there's a particular mood I think the conservatives are sniffing out, so to speak, and they're attempting to draw the broader SBC back to a more conservative socioculturalism. And so that's really what's going on there. So from my perspective, I mean, it's kind of a boring video, huh? But from my perspective, I think the SBC is probably, since they did vote this guy in, who is representative of this kind of adoption of more of a progressive, relatively speaking, progressive socioculturalism. My guess would be that they'll just continue down that. It is a slippery slope once you adopt critical theory, even as an analytic tool, as they've called it. Once you adopt that, I mean, there's lots of examples outside of the SBC in the broader evangelicalism. Even at my own alma mater, they've adopted critical race theory, and they once were, not very long ago, even when I was graduating from seminary there in 2003, were still very conservative and socioculturally conservative, but they adopted that. It started with liberation theology, which really behind that is critical theory. It's neo-Marxist, really. It comes from the Frankfurters back in the 20s and 30s. Frankfurt, Germany is where they were located, and they were thinkers who took Marxist ideas and really reduced them into kind of an identitarianism. And that's where we end up with this kind of intersectionality and just all these identity groups where we you pit each group against each other. So it's a very we, they, us, them kind of binary and competitive relationship and framework, in a way that we then think about how we relate to each other, even in the church. So we see that, like I said, even in my own alma mater has adopted that approach. It came in through my school came in through liberation theology, kind of subtly, and then and now it has blossomed into a full blown acceptance of critical race theory and even the LGBTQ kind of mood. So there's and that's something that needs to be identified as well, is that there is a kind of mood. It's not necessarily an absolute, oh yes, I am for LGBTQ, and that whole agenda, I guess we could say, some say, I'm full-fledged for all of that. A lot of these people aren't necessarily saying that, but indirectly they're supporting it. They're allowing that kind of agenda, so to speak, to be fostered and cultivated even in their own institutional DNAs. And so by not taking a hard stand, in other words, against that agenda and calling it out for what it is biblically, they're taking a soft bridge building kind of approach to that subculture, the LGBTQ subculture, and attempting to, that's the rationalization now, that they're attempting to, keep the door open, so to speak. And that's really not what ends up happening. And it's not what has ended up happening in my own experience from my own alma mater. I've already seen where that's gone sideways. It's gone south. And that rationalization does finally move out of the mood kind of ethos kind of situation into a full-blown acceptance of that community. And so we see that. I'm just using my own experience from my alma mater as an example of, even when now it's happening in SBC, we've seen that gone full blossom, say with something publication like Christianity Today, and their constituents, who they represent in the broader evangelicalism, as far as a mood, as far as even acceptance of the LGBTQ, of intersectionality, of critical race theory, of critical theory. We see that. It's not hidden. It's there. And so that's what, again, I'm bringing this back to the SBC. That's what's going on there. And that's so that you have these two contingencies kind of squaring off. And you do have this kind of old guard, but that's relative, like I said. Even back early 90s, mid 90s, into, early 2000, they were still pretty progressive, but then this kind of reform resurgence happened, and it kind of had a sociocultural impact upon the broader SBC as well. At least, I don't know, maybe even at just a superficial level. Maybe it didn't really ultimately have a concrete impact like some maybe had thought. Maybe what we're seeing now is that, in fact, it really never did kind of come out of its kind of liberal, so to speak, relatively speaking, liberal background. So those are the things that are going on. Those are the trends that, if we're an evangelical Christian, we see happening all around us. And especially for those of us who have grown up in pastoral ministry, like I did with my dad, I was included all the way growing up. I might as well have been I was like a mini me pastor of my dad, basically doing the ministry. So I've been directly involved in pastoral ministry growing up, even as a kid. And so experiencing how, just culturally, how things have progressed in the evangelical context, ecclesially, so in the churches, the evangelical churches in North America in particular. And I know that also has been happening in other parts of the world, the Western world, and the evangelical world as well, but under different circumstances, different pressures, and sometimes maybe not quite as binary, because I think outside of the United States and Europe, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, when it comes to the Baptist distinctives, in the Baptistic kind of way of church and Christian existence, things are different. Those countries actually are more secular. They've been more secularized, and they're more advanced, and have been more advanced in that, so to speak, relative to us here in the United States. So we kind of have these kind of battles going on culturally, these cultural war battles that they don't necessarily have present in their ecclesial context in the Baptistic world, in those parts of the world. So that goes on out there. I'm focusing primarily on my experience in North America and the experiences of others who I know in North America and the Baptistic world. So, and in the broader evangelical world as well. So not just limited to the Baptistic world. But so I guess I'm just saying all this because I find it interesting, it's just like part of the whole kind of like religious phenomena that takes place. And it's not, it's already happened in other denominations. So you have the Presbyterians, PCUSA, has this extreme liberal progressive agenda these days, but years ago, early Princeton days, they were the conservatives, So we see this kind of progression that's taken place in various different denominations here in North America. And so we're seeing it now hitting, just Bible believing conservative churches and denominations that years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have even imagined that probably would be possible. But as far as the SBC goes, yes, that they already had their own kind of slide into that years ago. There's some sort of recovery from that, but really, I don't think it was ever I don't think there was this recovery. I think that's what right now is illustrating that those seeds never were rooted out, so to speak, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. So. And so let's bring James White into this. I know that's a hard transition to James White, but he's not Southern Baptist. I think he's been ordained as a Southern Baptist. He was ordained in the Southern Baptist tradition as a pastor. That's where his ordination comes from. I don't believe now he's not Reformed. He's not in a Reformed or Southern Baptist church. He's in a Reformed Baptist church, which is pretty fundamentalist as far as I know, culturally. And very, very culturally conservative, socioculturally conservative. And so I was listening to him a couple nights ago where he was talking, a recent video he did on this, I think it was his last video, on the SBC, and his thoughts on it. And they kind of mirror what I was just saying as far as the trajectory they're on. And they're probably, just knowing how things progress on the slope that they're on, that they're going to end up very progressive in the not too distant future when it comes to these so-called sociocultural issues. And that was pretty much his take as well. So, but what I want to get to with James White then is the alternative and the antidote that he offers. And I want to talk a little bit about the consistency or the inconsistency, as the case may be, in regard to James White's that's kind of weird to say it like that, but that's how you say it. James White's antidote to this kind of liberal slide. And so, of course, it's rather convoluted. That's really what I want to get to with James White. It's pretty convoluted, honestly, the way that he's known for being a debater. He's in all kinds of debates with apologists from various religions, Islam and then Catholicism, so a different tradition, Christian tradition, some Mormons, so he's known for that, for apologetics and that kind of approach to Christianity in general. And so, but his commitment to this apologetic approach to things really, as far as I'm concerned, commits him to a very dissonant kind of existence, thought life, and the way that he attempts to push back against what he sees as a liberal slide. And so for him, I don't think that the liberal so-called or progressive slide in the SBC, which is what he is primarily critiquing as well, I don't think he sees it just as socioculturally. I think he sees it, and nothing is purely sociocultural. Everything is theological ultimately. So, and that's in a general sense, he wouldn't be completely wrong in that regard. But I think just that he, though, sees this slide stemming from a broader kind of movement, the broader movement that's been happening in the so-called even conservative evangelical world in regard to theology of retrieval. So it's kind of a weird, way into discussing theology of retrieval. But I think that's what he sees happening, that he sees a broad kind of big Eva, you've heard that language, big evangelicalism, big Eva, kind of movement that the SBC and the progressives have tapped into. And it's not just sociocultural for him in the way he's looking at it. It's also doctrinal, theologically speaking. So he sees, people like maybe Scott Swain or Michael Allen. He doesn't, I don't know if he even knows who those guys are per se, but what those guys represent and the work that they've done and their kind of Reformed theology retrieval, they're Presbyterians. They used to be SBC. I think both of them did. But he sees that kind of slide into retrieving so-called classical theism as related to this broader, and I don't know really how he connects these two things necessarily, this broader commitment to, critical race theory and those issues. So somehow he makes that connection. I think he's seeing just a big, like this mood kind of thing with the progressive elitist. And I think that's where maybe the tie-in for him, that he sees almost as an elitism, and that it's kind of trendy even for the Baptists to get on this kind of theology of retrieval bandwagon, so to speak, that's been taking place in the Presbyterian and Reform RCA, Reformed Churches of America, those kind of contexts. That it's been happening there for a while, and now I think he sees a lot of the SBCers who all, on the other hand, socioculturally are also promoting this kind of adoption of critical race theory and being soft. And that's an underspeak, being soft on some other sociocultural issues. I think he sees that kind of trajectory, he kind of throws it all into the same basket and the same combine, so to speak, for some reason. I'm not quite sure you can do that necessarily, but that's where I'm going to transition to now, is his response to these people who are retrieving classical theism. So, and I'll somehow in the end, which I don't want to really go much longer, but my famous last words, somehow I'm going to, I haven't figured it out yet. So somehow I'm going to try to relate his critique, or James White's critique of these SBCers, these elitist academic types, how he's connecting their adoption of this kind of theology retrieval, which I'll explain what that is in a second. He's connecting that and throwing that into the same basket with this adoption of critical race theory and other cultural issues. So what is theology of retrieval in a nutshell? Theology of retrieval, as it's being done, say, by Michael Allen or Scott Swain, they're the ones I'm most familiar with, or they're the most popular representatives of it. Their work is academic work, but they have a broader audience and it's pretty accessible. They made their stuff pretty accessible, I would say, for those who are motivated. But they're basically, a theology retrieval is it's the antidote. It's kind of, so this whole thing's, there's some real irony going on here, because theology retrieval is really intended to put the brakes on the evangelical churches, whether it's Presbyterian, Reformed confessionalism, or Reformed Baptists, or the SBC. It's intended on putting the brakes on a kind of liberal slide. So it's kind of, that's really what's going on. It's that these theology retrieval guys, believe that modern theology, has sullied the evangelical churches in general. And so they what they see as the antidote to that is to return. And they'll return by recovering the old theology, so to speak, the post-Reformed Orthodox theology that Richard Muller has written so much about. And I've read much of what he's written on it, all 4 volumes of his post-Reformation Reformed dogmatics, and much more. I've read of his material. And that's somebody that Swain and Allen and others like them would rely upon in their work, in their theology of recovery and retrieval of this kind of Reformed theology that developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so that's their antidote. It's a doctrinal antidote to a slide into theological liberalism. not so much theological socioculturalism. And so they would make that distinction, whereas James White throws that whole thing into a basket. It seems he ties. He doesn't make that. He doesn't see that as a viable distinction between theological liberalism and a liberal. I messed up earlier. A liberal socioculturalism. He sees those tied together in the mood that these guys are operating in. And so he's critiquing the whole thing and throwing them all under the same bus, so to speak. And so, but that's what they're doing. They're basically promoting, it's basically a promotion of the theology that developed in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, post-Reformation, post-like magisterial Reformation. So like the magisterial reformers might be, well, for sure, is Martin Luther. John Calvin could be included in that. He's a little just on Luther's tail a little bit, but he's part of that. Butzer, Bullinger, Zwingli, those guys would be. There's another guy, and he's a Swiss reformer with Zwingli and Bullinger. I can't pronounce his name, so I won't. I butcher it, so I won't even try. Oclampidius, that guy. So they would be part of like the magisterial. Olivanus, Ursinus, and now I'm starting to bleed in a little bit into the post-Reformed Orthodox theologians, where you have this development of federal or covenantal theology that begins to develop and take place. But they're recovering, these recoverers of this theology in the evangelical world from today that's where they're looking to. They're looking to covenantal theology. They're looking to what the Westminster Confession of Faith would be like an epitome of the theology that they're recovering. And that's what they believe is the antidote, not unlike what the original founders like Machen of Westminster Theological Seminary were doing when they were having a theological cultural war with the liberals who penetrated, from their perspective again, the liberals that had penetrated the seminary walls at Princeton. And so then we end up getting this Westminster Confession, or the Westminster Theological Seminary is founded out of that kind of reaction to theological liberalism as it had seeped into the lecterns at Princeton Seminary, Theological Seminary back in the day. So that's kind of like a precursor, or it could be even a microcosm of what's happening now, even kind of on a broader scale, because we're talking now about, like I'm saying, we're talking about Presbyterians, we're talking about Baptists, Southern Baptists, various other Baptists, and just non-denominational evangelicals in general who are involved in the work of this theology of retrieval in an attempt to, like I said, put the brakes on to stop any kind of adoption of theological liberalism post, like, say, Schleiermacher. So Friedrich Schleiermacher is often touted as the founder of theological liberalism. And then you have a bunch of theologians following subsequent to him, like Albrecht Ritschl, Isaac Dorner, Thomasius, and others, Hermann von Harnack a little bit later. You have these guys doing theology, lots of others actually, who I didn't name, but who penetrated the German theological world, which really the German theology back then, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th century, was very foundational and formative for theology in the broader continent there, but also in the UK, of course. And then that finally makes its way to America. And so that was pretty informative and impacting for the development of theological thinking back in the day from the German school, the Teutonics, and those were the guys who entered into Princeton Theological Seminary, and that's who Machen and Warfield even and others were fighting with, and now we see, and I think these guys today are attempting to do that same battle. They're in that battle with what they perceive to be theological liberalism that has seeped into the walls of evangelicalism writ large, whether that's Presbyterian or Southern Baptist or just non-denominational evangelicalism. And so that's what's happening, and I think that's what you have. You have James White, and he's sitting here. And this is where the dissonance for me comes in, or I don't have the dissonance. I think he has dissonance when he's attempting to critique these guys, like Matthew Barrett. He's somebody else. Matthew Barrett and Craig Carter. Let me throw out some of those names too, other than Swain and Allen, because it seems like, especially in the Baptistic world, Matthew Barrett and Craig Carter are having a big impact as far as this theology of retrieval that's going on. So they're part of that movement as well. And Matthew Barrett's a professor of theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So yeah, he's really making inroads with this kind of, it's basically a recovery of Thomism, Thomistic theology. They love Thomas Aquinas and the way that he was not necessarily Thomas Aquinas himself per se, although they probably like him too, but really it's his reception within the development of Reformed Orthodox theology. That's really the kind of Thomas that we're talking about. So we're not necessarily talking about the recovery of a Catholic Thomas Aquinas, the doctor of the church's doctor, the angelic doctor of the Roman Catholic Church. They're not necessarily recovering him per se, but in fact, they are recovering his themes, his theological themes, maybe as they've been supposedly synthesized with a Reformed theology, Reformed confessionalism. So you get the same doctrine of God, basically, that Thomas Aquinas, that's really where they really like to hit, or that's what they like to say, is that they're recovering a kind of Thomist doctrine of God, Thomist Trinitarianism. But what they end up doing, just like the post-Reformed Orthodox, is that they end up recovering more, I think, than their understanding or something. I don't. It's kind of confusing to me a little bit when I listen to these guys and read them. But I've listened a little bit more now to somebody like Matthew Barrett, and they talk about Thomas and Thomism as if it is this antidote that is going to stop this slide of thinking about God from kind of romantic rationalist Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment categories. They see that as the theological demon that needs to be exorcised, and they believe that Thomas Aquinas is the one in his reception of his theology and post-Reformed Orthodox theology and his development. They believe that recovering that and the classical theism therein will dispel with this focus upon God that is constructed, basically, what they would say, in our images. So a God who's all about feely, warm fuzzies, a God of love, emotionalism, personalism. They think they've labeled it that all theistic personalism. James Dozell, in his work, really goes after theistic personalism, and that's really what these theology retrieval guys are attempting to put the brakes on. And they believe that the post-Reformed Orthodox theology is what will do that. And so, but I mean, I don't agree with them, of course. I mean, I've written a lot about that on my blog and over the years. And clearly, I think that this idea that that God is basically this kind of idea that the premise is that God quit speaking in or after the 16th and 17th centuries in Protestant theology, and that who began to speak, 18th, 19th century Protestant theology, who was speaking then wasn't God, but was the spirit of the Antichrist. I mean, I don't think that's an overstatement. I think that a lot of these guys believe that for sure. I mean, they say that. And so that's why they believe that we need to return back to this Aristotelian theology. That's a better way probably to phrase it. And that's the way that Richard Muller explains the whole movement from the 16th and 17th century. He calls it Christian Aristotelianism. And I think that's a better way to frame this whole theology of retrieval, that they're retrieving a Christian Aristotelianism. Thomas Aquinas was the first, really, to synthesize Aristotelian categories with his development of Christian dogma, Christian theology. And then the post-Reformed Orthodox guys, they basically kind of modeled his Thomas Aquinas' scholastic methodology. And really that comes to Ramism. That's like the Ramist is a guy, it's the last name, Ramus, and Agricola, who was another who preceded Ramus. And but basically it's kind of this logical deductive way of analyzing and developing theological doctrine. It's kind of like logic chopping, theologic chopping. That's what that ends up being. So you end up with kind of abstract speculative theology, theological approach. And so that's really what these guys believe, though, will put the brakes on the church, the evangelical churches today, sliding into theological liberalism and a theistic personalist God, a God who they believe is really no more than a projection of humanity collectivistically turning to their collectivistic subjects and then constructing a notion of God who will affirm them in their desires, in their wants, in their wishes, and they will worship that as the God of the Bible. And so they believe that the only way out from that really is to just junk that, to jump over it as if it's a ditch, so to speak, and get back to the pure sacrosanct theology of Thomas Aquinas and how that was received in post-Reformed Orthodoxy. And so I'm not going to get into all the details really or the finer points, I guess, of how they attempt to do that, because it gets us into like prolegomena, theological methodological issues. And I've written a lot about that analogy of being and analogy of faith and things like that. It takes us into that discussion. So it's because that gets us into a knowledge of God, how we know God, what our bases are for claiming that we can know God and that we can actually speak about him in intelligible ways. So it gets us into that discussion. And I've written a lot about that as well. But I just want to say all of this really to kind of bring this back, I guess, to James White, which is interesting because I don't really think he tracks with any of this stuff, honestly, from what I've heard of him. He doesn't understand. I've never really heard him talk about theology of retrieval. Like I don't even know if he knows about that whole movement or anything. Like I don't see any evidence of that with him in the way that he speaks. So, sorry. Getting these texts here. Hang on. But I want to bring this back to James White because I just want to identify kind of a problem that I see with his approach in his critique of these theology of retrieval guys, which he doesn't call them that, but that's who he's critiquing. He doesn't seem to be aware of the literature, supporting that movement, the academic literature. He doesn't seem to be aware of that at all. So I want him to become aware. He needs to become aware of that if he's going to critique it in a intelligent and articulate way. So, and because he's not aware of that, he does. I think he's right in, of course, in critiquing a reception of Thomism, Christian Aristotelianism. But there's huge dissonance there because he is like presupposing that he came to his 5-point Calvinism as a Reformed Baptist in a vacuum. That he's not operating any differently than anyone else who is solo scriptura, not sola, but solo scriptura. So scripture all by itself and naked scripture. He is a proponent of that. And because of that, and it's very kind of the irony of that is that that's rather like a higher critical, like deconfessionalized way of thinking about the appropriation of various theological ideations. And so that's his critique, is that he critiques Thomas by saying, no, see, I have my Bible right here. And my Bible tells me that the tulip is it, that's where sound, that's what the Bible teaches. That's just pure good exegesis brings you to that conclusion. And so it's really, it's ironic in a way, I guess, to say about James White, but he's really naive about his own commitment to Calvinist theology, like kind of a Baptist Calvinist theology. So like just really it's an affirmation of the 5 points, or the Baptist London Confession of Faith. It's that to an extent. They're more covenantal than he is, but it's just ironic to me that he critiques these theology retrieval guys, which I do too, but he's doing it from like this idea that he's just doing it straight from Scripture, as if he's not an exegete or interpreter of Scripture, as if he has found this kind of presuppositionalist way into being an interpreter of Scripture. And that is the higher critical rationalist mood of interpreting Scripture. It's as if you're a tabula rasa, like a blank slate, a white slate, and that you can approach Scripture as its own kind of external stimuli, and based upon that deduction, or the deductions that you make from that stimuli, you can kind of have this pure way of reading Scripture as if it's not theologically received, as if there's no background theology, confessional theology, informing the way that you're interpreting Scripture. So if you don't recognize that, then you're going to end up conflating your a priori, your prior commitments to whatever theological traditions, and his happened to be 5-point Calvinism. It almost like received in an abstract sense. It is taken in an abstract sense from the development, or from the development of the theology that actually stands behind the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. So that's the irony to me. He's critiquing this reception of a Christian Aristotelianism, rightly so, in my opinion, in my view, of course. And yet at the same time, his own theology, categorically speaking, in regard to a doctrine of God, in regard to, even to salvation, is based upon the very Christian Aristotelianism, the very Neo-Thomism, the very Reformed scholastic Thomism that he says he's critiquing, that he's saying is artificial to, foreign to the categories of Holy Scripture and its reality in Jesus Christ. And so it's just an irony of the highest order to me. And it's it represents kind of like a cognitive dissonance as far as I can see. for James White, that he's engaging in this cognitive dissonance in regard to where he's getting his theology from in his Calvinism. He doesn't seem to understand. He doesn't make this connection. So it's ironic because he ends up critiquing supposedly the very premises of his own theology, as if those aren't the premises of his own theological framework as a Calvinist. So his doctrine of God, his understanding of predestination, for example, comes from a Aristotelian notion or a scholastic notion, more broadly speaking, which could entail Scotism or other emphases within historic or classical scholastic theology. But it's that notion of God and that reception of God within post-Reformed Orthodox theology, whereby James White's 5-point Calvinism, even as he's taken that in an abstract way, he's receiving that in an abstract way, in a vacuum kind of, from its development within post-Reformed Orthodoxy and within Christian Aristotelianism and Reformed Neo-Thomism or something like that, whatever you want to call it. So he's thinking in a circle. Like his critique is circular, because the very premise, like I said, of his own theological commitments come from this kind of reception of Thomas Aquinas' synthesis with Aristotle's categories. And so that is pretty ironic to me. And it's a serious inconsistency and a serious oversight by James White. He's not aware. He says he teaches church history and all of these things. You know, he's a professor of church history, historical theology, and yet he doesn't even seem to evince a knowledge of these kinds of basic realities on the ground, with particular reference to the development of Reformed Orthodoxy. And so he doesn't understand that Reformed Orthodoxy theologically produced his 5-point Calvinism. He just thinks that comes straight from a pure rationalist reading of the Bible, like a naturalist reading of the Bible. And that's really the irony of James White and his whole approach. So he doesn't really have a legitimate critique to make of someone like Matthew Barrett, somebody who's promoting Thomas Aquinas and his reception and his development within Reformed Orthodoxy. James White has no legitimate or credible critique to make of that, as long as he's affirming the theology that funds a 5-point Calvinism. So I don't know why somebody doesn't love James White enough to tell him that, because that's what he needs to be told. He'll never. I have one viewer right now. Thank you for watching this, whoever you are. We're at the tail end here, but James White, I mean, nobody's ever going to tell him that. I had an argument. The closest I've corresponded with James White once or twice. He interacted with me on Twitter, but I had a real kind of longish interaction with his co-host, Rich. I don't remember his last name, but he got onto Twitter. He's on Twitter, I think, still, probably. And we really battled it out. And I was bringing these things to his attention. And he's kind of a nasty guy, to be honest. So since I was blowing his mind, I think, a little bit, like confronting him with things that he had never even considered, maybe, like the things I just mentioned about James White, the background to his own theology. This Rich guy definitely never had heard of any of this, and so he just couldn't believe it. And he started getting nasty with me. So I ended up blocking him. He blocked me or something. But that's as close as I've gotten to James White. But somebody who's close to James White, who he might respect, but that's the problem. The people that he respects are basically just going to tell him what he wants to hear, or they think just like he does. And they need to be exposed to this reality as well. That the theology that funds 5-point Calvinism is this kind of reception of a Reformed scholastic Neo-Thomism, or whatever you want to call it, post-Reformed Orthodoxy. That's what funds 5-point Calvinism. So if that's the very basis of your theology in 5-point Calvinism downstream, because that's not supposed to be representative of the totality of Reformed theology. That's another problem that these Reformed Baptists have. But it's not supposed to be representative of the whole of Reformed theology. It's not historically, but that's the way they take it in a way. But yeah, that's really kind of what's going on. That there's a lot of dissonance there because James White is basically a naturalist. He's not a confessionally reformed Christian, and so because of that, he operates like it's very ironic to me. He operates like a naturalist. He might as well just be a higher critic, of Scripture. I mean, he has the piety. That's really what fundamentalism was. You had Puritanism kind of feeding into that socioculturally, theologically. So there's that piety that's being brought to his higher criticism. That's kind of like warm-hearted love for Christ, in a sense. So that's there. So he's not like a naked higher critic. He's not one of these German higher critics from yesteryear or something. He's not that. But functionally, he's operating when he comes to his the way that he thinks that he can interpret Scripture. He's functioning just like they did. That they view Scripture in a deconfessionalized, or unchristian artifact of history. So you have the history of religion school, like that whole mood. That's the irony of James White and people like James White, that they're critiquing the bases of their own theology in their 5-point Calvinism, and yet they're critiquing that from their commitment, their unconscious commitment, really, to a naturalist rationalism, which the theology of retrieval guys are attempting to put the brakes on through their recovery of classical theism, which is an anachronism of their classical theism, though, post-medieval classical theism. And so you have it's a strange, almost convoluted combine here. So you have him trying to counter them. They don't even know who he is. They don't even acknowledge James White, most of those guys, as a legitimate or credible critic, which he actually isn't, I don't think, as I've just been talking about, because of the reasons I've mentioned. And sorry, got a text here. And so, but then you have these theology retrieval guys on a sociocultural front, who many of them are either aloof or they're intentionally for kind of this adoption of critical theory, critical race theory in their churches and their seminaries. And so it's just a very strange situation. And there's lots of complexity and moving parts here. James White really is he's really just at the popular level. I don't really consider James White an academic theologically, which is great. To me, theological academia, as far as its mindset, it is very elitist. So it's almost like that. It's almost like James White's populist, and he's fighting the elitists. I think that's the way he would see it. I don't think you have to see it that way, but yeah, it's just. But when we reduce this whole thing to kind of like a theological discussion, it's just really, because of what I just kind of detailed, it's never really going to resolve because not on these Reformed Baptist side versus the confessional Reformed guys and theology retrieval type people on this side, because you do have these moving parts. These Reformed Baptist types, they don't even understand really the sources of their own theology historically. They just think it's straight from Scripture, pure Scripture, a tabula rasa, like I talked about. And so that's their approach. Then you have these so-called confessional guys, these theology retrieval guys, and on the Baptistic and the Presbyterian continuum, and anything else in between there, Reformed Church, whoever you are, non-denominational, evangelical, but you would identify as a confessional Christian. even Reformed or Lutheran. So you have this big combine, and so it's very convoluted, and it's hard to recognize what's exactly going on. I think I just did identify some of the moving parts, though, for us and what's going on with somebody like James White, and let's say he's a representative of the Reformed Baptist side, which is populist, versus the confessional Reformed people who tend to be more theological academics, who tend to be more on the elitist continuum, and they think that they're doing a good thing by recovering this classical theism, so called. But then at the same time, they're affirming social critical theory and theories that developed in the very period of modernity. So ideationally, in modernity, that when it comes to theology, they label as demonic and antichrist. So again, more dissonance on the confessional reform side as well when it comes to that aspect of this. So you need to become an evangelical Calvinist. That's really the antidote. And you should pick up our 2 books, the books that Mike Habitz and I co-edited and authored, multi-author volumes. One came out, the first one in 2012, the second one in 2017, and they're both titled. Their main title is Evangelical Calvinism. So you need to become an evangelical Calvinist, and then everything will make sense to you. I'm kidding, but it will. I think I do think there's a better way, and that it's been present by way of mood throughout the history and development of Protestant theology from the beginning and prior to. So we like to reach back to, the patristic theology. That's a big thing. And that's, of course, I've renamed my blog the Athanasian Reformed because of that influence on Torrance, Karl Barth. But those guys are antichrist. That's what the theology retrieval guys would say. They're modern theologians, or we can cherry pick some things from Barth. Some of them will do that, go that far, but that's as far as they'll go. But anyway, I've been rambling like I normally do, but hopefully if you watch this, you found something valuable. I think I found something valuable as I started to articulate things maybe in the last 20 minutes or so. The first part wasn't so great, but the last 20 minutes of this video, I think was interesting even to me as I was articulating things or thinking things out loud about some of these moving parts between these competing factions within a small portion of Christendom in North America, evangelicalism, on the various continuums represented therein. So I think there was some identification of some of the moving parts going on, where there's dissonance happening on both sides, and then we have the SBC, as I started out talking about the SBC in this video, falling kind of on either side of that continuum of the theology retrieval, confessional reform types versus the Reformed Baptist types. And so we have lots of parts here, like I said, moving and lots of confusion as a result of that. So hopefully some of the stuff I just brought up here, off the top, thinking out loud, help maybe identify why or where the confusion in all of this is stemming from, just in broad terms. So, and maybe with some specifics peppered in here and there. So, all right, thanks for watching. I've gone an hour and 10 minutes. It's a Sunday night, late Sunday night, so I didn't expect anybody to actually pay attention to this. So we'll see if I even leave it up on my YouTube channel. But thanks for watching, whoever my one viewer is, and have a good night.